The billionaire took his model date to a yacht party, then saw his black ex with a tech CEO. A story about power, pride, and the price of choosing success over love. The champagne flute trembled in Donald Gilbert's hand as he stood on the deck of the 200-foot superyacht Fortune's Edge, watching his entire world collapse in real time. The crystal nearly slipped from his fingers that had signed billion-dollar deals without a single tremor, as he stared across the moonlit Mediterranean at something that shouldn't exist. Kiara. His Kiara. Except she wasn't his anymore. She stood 30 feet away on the main deck, her deep brown skin glowing like burnished gold under the yacht's ambient lighting, wearing a stunning emerald dress that hugged every curve he'd once worshipped. Her natural hair fell in perfect coils past her shoulders, and when she threw her head back and laughed, that musical sound that used to make his chest tight with pure joy, Donald felt something inside him shatter like expensive porcelain hitting marble. But it wasn't just seeing her that made his blood freeze. It was the man beside her. Prince Eden. Tech billionaire. Forbes cover story. The man whose revolutionary AI platform had just secured a $50 billion valuation. The man who was looking at Kiara the way Donald used to look at her. The way he'd forgotten how to look at her. Baby, you're gripping that glass like you're trying to crush diamonds, purred Ivy Castellanos, the Brazilian supermodel draped against his arm like a designer accessory. Her accent was honey smooth, her body magazine perfect, her smile practiced to perfection. Everything Kiara wasn't. Everything Donald had convinced himself he wanted instead. Hello, beautiful souls. I hope you're settling in comfortably wherever you're watching this unfold. Maybe you're curled up on your couch, maybe you're listening during your commute, or perhaps you're stealing a moment during your lunch break. How are you doing today? Life treating you well? And hey, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button because trust me, you're going to want to follow this journey to the very end. Donald forced his grip to relax, but his eyes stayed locked on the impossible scene before him. 6 months. It had been 6 months since their divorce was finalized. 6 months since he'd told Kiara that their marriage was holding back his potential. 6 months since he'd chosen his empire over her heart. I need some air, he managed, his voice rough despite the careful control he'd spent decades perfecting. Ivy's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. Darling, we're on a yacht. It's literally all air. But Donald was already moving, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished deck as he navigated through clusters of Monaco's elite, oil heiresses, tech moguls, pharmaceutical dynasties, all of them clutching their drinks and their secrets with equal desperation. The party was a who's who of obscene wealth, the kind of gathering where casual conversations involved 9-figure acquisitions and private islands changed hands over appetizers. He'd brought Ivy to prove a point. To himself. To the world. To Kiara, if she ever saw the tabloid photos that would inevitably surface. Look how well he was doing. Look how he'd upgraded. Look how little their marriage had meant. Except now Kiara was here, radiant and laughing and apparently very much moved on, and Donald felt like a man who'd just realized he'd sold his soul for fool's gold. The yacht's owner, petroleum heiress Charlotte Dubois, materialized beside him with the supernatural timing of the professionally wealthy. Donald, darling, I see you've spotted our surprise guests. Her smile was sharp as a blade, her French accent adding elegant venom to every word. Prince brought her as his date. Quite the stunning couple, don't you think? The words hit him like physical blows. Date. Couple. His chest constricted as he watched Prince's hand settle possessively on the small of Kiara's back. The exact spot Donald used to touch when he wanted to ground himself, to remember what mattered most. Stunning, he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Charlotte's laugh tinkled like breaking crystal. You know, it's funny how life works, isn't it? Just when we think we've got everything figured out. She drifted away, leaving Donald alone with his champagne and his devastating realization. In trying to prove he'd moved on, he'd discovered he never had. Not even close. Across the deck, as if summoned by his tortured thoughts, Kiara's eyes found his. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, the space between them crackled with everything they'd shared, everything they'd lost, everything that might have been. Her expression shifted from surprise to something he couldn't quite read. Pain? Pity? Indifference? Then Prince whispered something in her ear, and she turned away, her musical laughter carrying on the salt-tinged breeze like a ghost of their former happiness. Donald Gilbert had built an empire worth $37 billion. He'd conquered markets, crushed competitors, and turned his name into a synonym for unstoppable success. But as he stood on that yacht, watching the woman he'd thrown away shine in another man's arms, He faced a truth that no amount of money could change. Some mistakes were too expensive to buy back, and some lessons could only be learned when it was already too late. What had he done? And was there any way to undo the most costly decision of his life? The weight of his $37 billion had never felt heavier as Donald retreated to the yacht's upper deck, seeking refuge from the scene below. But there was no escaping the memories that crashed over him like Mediterranean waves against the hull. 3 years ago, Kiara Reeves had been a brilliant systems analyst working for one of his tech acquisitions. Not the kind of woman who usually caught his attention. She wore sensible shoes and carried herself with quiet confidence rather than desperate ambition. She'd been in the conference room when he'd arrived to oversee the integration, her natural hair pulled back in a simple bun, her focus entirely on the holographic displays showing data flows that most people couldn't begin to understand. "The vulnerability is in the API gateway," she'd said, her voice steady and sure as she pointed to a section of code that had stumped his entire security team. "Someone's been probing for weeks, but they are patient. Methodical. This isn't some script kiddie, this is professional-grade corporate espionage." Donald had found himself leaning forward, captivated not just by her intelligence but by the way she seemed completely unimpressed by his presence. While everyone else in the room had been stealing glances at the legendary Donald Gilbert, Kiara had been entirely focused on the problem at hand. "How do you know?" he'd asked. She'd turned those dark, expressive eyes on him for the first time, and something had shifted in his chest. Something he'd thought was buried under decades of calculated relationships and strategic marriages to society connections. "Because I think like they do," she'd said simply. "You have to understand your enemy to defeat them." That had been the beginning. What followed was a courtship unlike anything in Donald's carefully orchestrated life. Kiara didn't want expensive restaurants or private jets to Paris. She wanted long walks through Central Park where they talked about everything. His fears about never being enough, her dreams of building technology that could help people instead of just generating profit. She wanted quiet evenings in her tiny Brooklyn apartment, cooking together and arguing about whether artificial intelligence would save humanity or doom it. For the first time in his adult life, Donald had felt seen. Not as a bank account or a networking opportunity or a trophy to be won, but as a man with dreams and doubts and a desperate need to matter for reasons beyond his net worth. Their wedding had been small, intimate, just their closest friends and family in her grandmother's church in Atlanta. Kiara had worn her grandmother's dress, simple white satin that made her glow with happiness. When she'd walked down that aisle, Donald had felt richer than all his billions had ever made him feel. "You sure you're ready for this life?" he'd whispered during their first dance, spinning her slowly to the sound of her grandmother's favorite gospel song. "I'm not marrying your life," she'd whispered back, her hand warm against his cheek. "I'm marrying you. The man who stays up all night worried about whether his employees can afford their children's medical bills. The man who still calls his mother every Sunday even though she drives you crazy. The man who thinks no one notices when he anonymously pays off students' lunch debts at the school near his office." Those had been golden days. Kiara had kept working, refusing his offers to set her up in some cushy consulting role. Instead, she'd started her own cybersecurity firm, building it from nothing with the same quiet determination that had first caught his attention. Donald had found himself rushing home from meetings just to hear about her day, to see the excitement in her eyes when she talked about protecting small businesses from hackers or helping nonprofits secure their donor data. But success was a demanding mistress, and Donald had always been her most devoted servant. The first crack had appeared during their second year of marriage, when the Singapore deal had required him to travel for 6 weeks. Kiara had supported him, understanding the magnitude of the opportunity. But when he'd extended the trip by another month to pursue additional acquisitions, something had shifted in her voice during their nightly calls. "I miss you," she'd said one evening, and he'd heard something fragile in those 3 words. "I miss you too, baby. Just a few more weeks, and then we'll take that vacation to Bali you wanted." But there had always been just a few more weeks. Just one more deal. Just one more acquisition that was too important to pass up. Hey, I know some of you watching might be thinking about someone special in your own life right now. Drop a comment below and tell me about the moment you knew they were the one. And if you're loving this story already, smash that subscribe button because Donald's journey is just getting started. The 3rd year had been worse. Donald's empire had reached a critical expansion phase, and every day brought new opportunities, new challenges, new reasons why he couldn't come home for dinner or couldn't make it to Kiara's company's anniversary party or couldn't be present for the small moments that apparently mattered so much to her. "I feel like I'm married to a ghost," she'd told him one evening when he'd finally made it home after midnight, finding her asleep on the couch with her laptop still open, working on code for a client who couldn't afford to hire a big firm. "I'm building something for us," he'd said, the words automatic and hollow even to his own ears. "No, Donald. You're building something for you. And that's okay. It's who you are. It's what drives you. But don't pretend it's for us when there is no us anymore. There's just you and your empire, and I'm just furniture you come home to." The fight that followed had been their worst yet, voices raised in a way that felt foreign and terrible. She'd accused him of treating their marriage like another acquisition to be managed. He'd accused her of not understanding the pressure he was under, the responsibility he carried for thousands of employees and shareholders. "I understood the pressure," she'd shot back, tears streaming down her face. "What I didn't understand was that you'd forgotten why any of it was supposed to matter in the first place." They'd tried counseling, but Donald had approached it like another business problem to be solved with the right strategy and sufficient resources. He'd hired the best therapist money could buy, scheduled sessions around his meetings, and grown frustrated when their marriage couldn't be fixed with the same decisive action that worked in boardrooms. The end had come not with dramatic confrontation but with quiet resignation. Kiara had stopped fighting for his attention, stopped asking him to prioritize their relationship, stopped believing that love could compete with ambition in Donald's carefully ordered world. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other, her voice calm and tired as she'd sat across from him at their kitchen island, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he'd barely noticed her making. "Can't do what?" "Love someone who's already married to his empire." The divorce had been swift and civilized, handled by expensive lawyers who'd treated their broken marriage like any other asset to be divided. Kiara had asked for almost nothing, just enough to keep her business running and a clean break from the Gilbert name and everything it represented. Donald had thrown himself into work with renewed vigor, telling himself he was finally free to focus on what really mattered. He'd acquired 3 more companies, expanded into emerging markets, and watched his net worth climb toward $40 billion. And he'd felt emptier than he ever had in his life. Now, standing on this yacht with his upgrade draped on his arm, watching the woman he'd thrown away laugh with genuine joy in another man's arms, Donald finally understood the difference between being wealthy and being rich. Wealth was numbers in accounts and assets on spreadsheets. Richness was the way Kiara's eyes used to light up when he walked through the door. And he had traded the latter for the former, convinced himself it was a smart business decision. The sound of heels on the deck announced Ivy's arrival. "There you are, darling. People are starting to ask where the famous Donald Gilbert has disappeared to." Her hand slid possessively around his arm, her smile bright and practiced. "Come on, let's go be fabulous together." As they descended back toward the party, Donald caught another glimpse of Kiara and Prince. They were deep in conversation with a small group, and even from a distance, he could see the way she gestured with passionate intensity when she talked about something she cared about. The way she used to talk to him, back when he'd been present enough to listen. The question that had haunted him for 6 months crystallized into painful clarity. Had he lost the love of his life for an empire that would never love him back? The collision was inevitable. Donald had spent the better part of an hour trying to navigate the yacht's social landscape while avoiding the gravitational pull of Kiara's presence. But Charlotte Dubois had other plans. Their hostess appeared at his elbow during a conversation about rare earth mineral investments, her smile sharp with mischief. "Donald, darling, you simply must meet our other tech revolutionary," she announced, her voice carrying just far enough to turn heads. "Prince Eden has been absolutely fascinating us with stories about his AI breakthrough." Before Donald could manufacture an excuse, Charlotte was already steering him through the crowd with the determination of a woman accustomed to orchestrating exactly the kind of social theater that made her parties legendary. Prince Eden stood near the yacht's main bar, and up close, Donald could see why Kiara might be drawn to him. He was tall, lean, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from building something revolutionary rather than simply acquiring what others had built. His dark skin had the healthy glow of someone who actually took time for himself, and when he smiled, which he was doing now, at something Kiara had just whispered in his ear, it reached his eyes in a way Donald had forgotten was possible. "Prince, I'd like you to meet Donald Gilbert," Charlotte announced with theatrical grandeur. "I believe you two have some mutual interests." The handshake was firm, professional, giving nothing away. But Donald caught the slight tightening around Prince's eyes, the barely perceptible shift in his posture. He knew exactly who Donald was. More importantly, he knew exactly what Donald had been to the woman standing beside him. "Mr. Gilbert," Prince said, his voice carrying the slight accent that spoke of elite education and international upbringing. "I've followed your work for years. Your acquisition strategy is legendary." The words were polite, but Donald heard the subtext. "I know what you acquire. And I know what you discard. And I've been reading about your AI platform," Donald replied smoothly, falling back on decades of boardroom diplomacy. "Quite impressive. Though I have to wonder about the long-term scalability of altruistic business models." It was a subtle jab, the kind of intellectual chess move that Donald had perfected in 1,000 business negotiations. Prince's AI company was famous for its ethical guidelines, its commitment to beneficial technology over pure profit maximization. "Interesting perspective," Prince replied, his smile never wavering. "Though I've found that when you build something that actually improves people's lives, scalability tends to take care of itself. Amazing how sustainability works when your success isn't dependent on extraction." The word extraction hit Donald like a physical blow. It was exactly the kind of language Kiara used to use when they'd argued about his business practices, the way his empire was built on taking value from others rather than creating it. "Gentlemen," Kiara's voice cut through the tension like silk over steel. "I'm sure our hostess didn't arrange this introduction so you could measure portfolios." She stepped slightly closer to Prince, a movement so small it would have been meaningless to anyone else. But Donald noticed the subtle shift in her body language, the way she created a united front without even thinking about it. The way she used to do with him, back when they'd faced the world as a team. "Kiara," Donald said, and heard his own voice crack slightly on her name. 6 months, and he still couldn't say it without feeling like he was confessing something. "Donald." Her tone was carefully neutral, professionally polite. The voice she might use with any stranger at a networking event. It hurt worse than anger would have. "You look," he started to say, "beautiful, radiant, like everything he'd been searching for in every woman since their divorce." But the words stuck in his throat as he noticed the thin gold chain around her neck, a new piece of jewelry he didn't recognize. Simple, elegant, the kind of thoughtful gift that spoke of attention and care. "I look happy," she finished for him, and there was something in her voice, not cruelty, but a quiet strength he'd never heard before. "I am happy." The words were a stiletto between his ribs, precise and devastating. Prince's hand settled on the small of her back, that same spot Donald used to claim as his own, and Kiara leaned into the touch with unconscious ease. They moved together like people who fit, who belonged, who had found in each other something worth protecting. "We should probably rejoin our friends," Prince said, and Donald heard the dismissal in his tone. Polite but final. "Kiara was just telling me about the new security protocol she's implementing for my company. Brilliant work, as always." Of course. Of course Prince was smart enough to value Kiara's mind, her talent, her revolutionary approach to cybersecurity. Of course he was the kind of man who would be fascinated by her intelligence rather than threatened by it. "I'd love to hear about it," Donald heard himself saying, desperation making him bold. Kiara always had the most innovative approaches to complex problems. Kiara's eyebrows rose slightly. "Did I? Funny. I don't recall you ever asking about my work when it mattered." The hit was clean and brutal, delivered with surgical precision. Around them, the party continued its glittering dance of wealth and influence, but Donald felt like he was drowning in champagne and regret. "That's not fair," he said, and immediately regretted the words. They sounded petulant, defensive, exactly like the man who had always made everything about his own wounded feelings rather than acknowledging the damage he'd caused. "Fair." Kiara's laugh was soft but sharp. "Donald, you missed our 3rd anniversary dinner because of a conference call about a hotel chain acquisition in Dubai. When I asked you about it later, you told me it was just businesses and that I should understand the stakes involved. But my work was always just a cute hobby you tolerated when it didn't interfere with your empire building." Prince's expression had shifted, and Donald saw something dangerous flicker in the other man's eyes. The protective instinct of someone who clearly treasured what Donald had thrown away. "Perhaps we should," Prince began, but Kiara placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It's okay," she said softly. "Ancient history." But it wasn't ancient history. Not for Donald. Standing there, watching the woman he'd loved with casual cruelty rebuild herself into someone radiant and strong and completely beyond his reach, he felt the full weight of every choice he'd made in the last 3 years. "Hey, I'm curious, have you ever had a moment where you realized you'd made a terrible mistake? Drop a comment below and let me know. And while you're at it, make sure you're subscribed because this story is about to get even more intense." "Actually," Donald found himself saying, his voice rough with something that might have been desperation. "I'd like to apologize. For not asking. For not seeing. For not being the man you deserved." Kiara went very still. Prince's hand tightened protectively on her back. The space between them crackled with old pain and fresh possibility. "Donald," she started to say. But her words were cut off by a sudden commotion from the yacht's main deck. Shouts, running footsteps, the sound of expensive crystal hitting the floor. Then Charlotte Dubois's voice, sharp with panic. "Someone call the Coast Guard. There's been an accident." Through the crowd, Donald caught a glimpse of chaos, a smaller yacht in the distance, listing badly to one side, its lights strobing in obvious distress. The party's glittering facade cracked like thin ice, revealing the ocean's ancient indifference to human wealth and pretension. In that moment of crisis, as sirens began to wail across the Mediterranean night, Donald saw something that made his chest tighten with familiar longing. Kiara and Prince moving together with the unconscious coordination of a team, her brilliant mind already analyzing the situation while his resources kicked into action. The way he and Kiara used to move together, back when they'd faced the world as partners instead of adversaries. And as he watched them spring into action, Donald faced a truth more terrifying than any business crisis he'd ever navigated. He wasn't just watching his ex-wife with her new love. He was watching the life he could have had if he'd been brave enough to choose love over empire. The question now was whether it was too late to learn from the most expensive mistake of his life, or if some opportunities, once lost, could never be reclaimed. The rescue operation transformed the yacht party from glittering spectacle to urgent mission in the space of heartbeats. But it was Kiara who took charge, her cybersecurity expertise suddenly critical as she coordinated communications between the Coast Guard, the distressed vessel, and emergency responders. "Their GPS is down and their radio is failing," she called out, her fingers flying over Prince's tablet as she worked to establish a stable communication link. The electrical system took damage when they hit that debris field. Donald found himself drawn toward the command center she'd created near the yacht's communications array, watching with growing amazement as the woman he'd dismissed as having a cute hobby orchestrated a complex rescue operation using skills he'd never bothered to fully appreciate. "Can you boost their signal?" Prince asked, his own phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with maritime authorities. "I'm routing their emergency beacon through our yacht's satellite uplink," Kiara replied without looking up. "It's not standard protocol, but it'll give the Coast Guard a clear lock on their position." She was magnificent. Brilliant and capable and completely in her element, solving problems with the same focused intensity that had first caught Donald's attention in that conference room years ago. The same intensity he'd stopped paying attention to when board meetings and acquisition targets became more interesting than his wife's revolutionary mind. "How did you know to do that?" Donald asked, unable to stop himself from stepping closer. Kiara glanced up, and for a moment, her professional mask slipped. "Because I pay attention to systems," she said quietly. "I understand how things work together, how they are supposed to support each other." The subtext was clear, and it hit Donald like a physical blow. She wasn't just talking about communication arrays and satellite uplinks. Ivy appeared at his elbow, her grip on his arm possessive and tight. "Baby, shouldn't we let the professionals handle this? We could go to the upper deck, have some more champagne." "People are in danger," Donald said, not taking his eyes off Kiara's work. "Yes, but it's not our problem, is it?" Ivy's voice carried that particular tone of wealthy disconnection that Donald was suddenly hearing for the first time. "I mean, they have insurance, don't they?" The callousness of the comment made Donald's stomach turn. 3 years ago, Kiara would have been the first person over the rail if she'd thought she could help directly. She'd never been able to turn away from someone in need, whether it was a stranded yacht or a small business being targeted by hackers. "Actually," Prince said, ending his call and moving to Kiara's side, "the family on that boat, I know them. The Martinellis. They run a sustainable fishing operation in Nice. Good people trying to make an honest living." Of course Prince knew them. Of course he cared about sustainable fishing and honest livings and good people. Of course he was the kind of man who noticed the smaller boats in harbor instead of just competing to see who had the biggest yacht. "Their daughter is diabetic," Prince continued, his voice tight with worry. "If they are stuck out there too long without power for her medication refrigeration." Kiara's hands stilled on the tablet. "How long have they been adrift?" 3 hours, maybe 4. "That's cutting it close." Kiara's fingers resumed their rapid work, but Donald could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she bit her lower lip when she was trying to solve an impossible problem. Habits he'd memoized during their marriage, details he'd forgotten until this moment of crisis. What can we do? Donald found himself asking. Both Kiara and Prince looked at him with surprise. Fair enough. The Donald Gilbert they knew had never been the kind of man to ask how he could help strangers in distress. We need a boat fast enough to reach them before the Coast Guard, Kiara said. Someone needs to get emergency medication to that little girl. I have a speedboat, Charlotte offered, but even as she spoke, they could see the problem. The Mediterranean was rough tonight, whitecaps visible even from the safety of the large yacht. Charlotte's racing boat was built for calm seas and showing off, not emergency rescue operations in difficult conditions. Too dangerous, Prince said immediately. We'd need someone with serious maritime experience to handle those seas. Donald felt something stir in his chest, a memory from long before billion-dollar empires and supermodel accessories. I could do it. The statement hung in the salt air like a challenge. Kiara stared at him, her expression unreadable. Donald, she said slowly, you haven't been on a boat in years. I grew up on boats, he replied, and it was true. Before the money, before the empire, before he'd forgotten who he used to be, Donald Gilbert had been a kid from Maine whose father had made a living lobstering the cold Atlantic waters. He'd learned to read weather and water before he'd learned to read financial statements. That was a long time ago, Kiara said softly. Some things you don't forget. It was Prince who made the decision. If you're serious, we need to move now. Every minute counts. The next 20 minutes were a blur of preparation and controlled urgency. Donald found himself working alongside the man his ex-wife was dating, their shared focus on the mission temporarily overriding the personal tensions between them. Prince gathered medical supplies while Donald checked the speedboat's engine and navigation systems. Kiara coordinated with emergency services and loaded communication equipment that would let them stay in contact with the rescue effort. You don't have to do this, she said quietly as Donald made final preparations for launch. He looked up from the boat's GPS system to find her standing close enough that he could smell her familiar perfume, something light and floral that she'd worn since college. For a moment, they were alone in the bubble of crisis preparation, the party noise fading to background static. Yes, I do, he said simply. Why? It was a loaded question, carrying the weight of their entire shared history. Why now? Why this? Why couldn't he have cared about people when it mattered for their marriage? Because it's the right thing to do, Donald said. Because someone needs help, and I can provide it. Because. He hesitated, then pushed forward with painful honesty. Because it's what you would do. What you always did. And maybe it's time I remembered what that felt like. Something shifted in Kiara's expression. Not forgiveness, it was too soon and he'd hurt her too deeply for that. But something softer than the professional politeness she'd been maintaining all evening. Be careful out there, she said. Those seas are rougher than they look. I will. Donald. She paused, seeming to wrestle with words. The man I fell in love with, he would have done this. Without hesitation. I'd forgotten that version of you existed. Before he could respond, Prince appeared with the medical supplies and emergency beacon. Ready? Donald nodded, but as he prepared to cast off, he caught sight of Ivy standing at the yacht's rail. Her expression was a mixture of disbelief and disgust, as if she couldn't understand why her billionaire date was risking his life for people he'd never met. The contrast with Kiara, who was double-checking his emergency supplies and programming backup communication frequencies, couldn't have been more stark. Bring them home safe, Kiara called as the speedboat's engine roared to life. Donald looked back at her one last time, standing there in her emerald dress with the moonlight in her hair and worry in her dark eyes. For a moment, time folded, and she was his wife again, the woman who'd believed in the better version of himself even when he'd stopped believing in it. Then he was racing across dark water toward a family in distress, finally remembering what it felt like to be the kind of man worth loving. Behind him, the yacht's lights faded into the Mediterranean night. Ahead, guided by Kiara's technical expertise and Prince's compassion, he chased the chance to be someone worthy of the life he'd thrown away. But as the speedboat cut through increasingly rough seas, Donald couldn't shake the feeling that this rescue mission was about more than just the Martinelli family. It was about discovering whether the man Kiara had once loved still existed somewhere beneath the empire he'd built, and whether it was too late to let that man surface again. The rescue operation succeeded, but it nearly cost Donald his life. By the time he'd reached the Martinelli's disabled yacht, the Mediterranean had turned violent, 8-foot swells making the transfer of medical supplies a nightmare of timing and courage. The Italian family, father, mother, and 12-year-old diabetic daughter, had been adrift for 6 hours, their emergency power failing and young Sophia's insulin running dangerously warm. Donald had fought 20-foot seas that reminded him viscerally of his childhood in Maine, when winter storms had turned familiar waters into liquid mountains. He'd forgotten the physical poetry of reading waves, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between safe passage and catastrophic collision. His billion-dollar empire meant nothing to the ocean's ancient indifference. But he'd gotten the medicine to Sophia, coordinated with the Coast Guard for safe tow, and somehow made it back to the yacht as dawn painted the Mediterranean sky in shades of gold and pink. He was exhausted, soaked, running on nothing but adrenaline and coffee when Kiara found him on the upper deck, finally alone after an hour of well-meaning congratulations from the party guests. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling beside him on the cushioned bench where he'd collapsed. "Like I got hit by a freight train made of seawater," Donald admitted, surprised by his own honesty. When had he stopped being honest with her? When had every conversation become a performance? "But good," he continued. "Really good. I'd forgotten what it felt like to actually help someone. To use my hands for something other than signing acquisition papers." Kiara was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the soft morning light. "You were incredible out there," she said finally. "The way you handled those seas. I'd forgotten you used to be fearless." "I'd forgotten too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the calm water. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and possibility bright. Other guests were beginning to stir below, but for now, they existed in a bubble of quiet honesty that felt dangerously like old times. "Can I ask you something?" Kiara said. "Anything." "What happened to us, Donald? Really happened. Not the lawyer's version or the version you tell yourself to sleep at night. What actually broke us apart?" The question hung in the salt air like a challenge. Donald felt the familiar urge to deflect, to blame external pressures and impossible choices. But something about the night's events, the reminder of who he used to be, made him want to try radical honesty instead. "I got scared," he said simply. "Of what?" "Of not being enough. Of being ordinary. Of being just another guy from Maine who got lucky instead of someone who actually deserved success." He paused, watching seabirds wheel against the brightening sky. "You loved me when I was nobody. And instead of trusting that love, I decided I needed to become someone worthy of it. Someone impressive enough that you'd never leave. So you became someone I couldn't live with." "Yeah." The word was barely a whisper. "The more successful I got, the more terrified I became that it was all a house of cards. That if I stopped grinding, stopped acquiring, stopped proving myself, everyone would realize I was just a fraud. Including you." Kiara was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft with old pain. "Do you know what I loved most about you when we met? My devastating charm and rugged good looks." She laughed despite herself, and the sound made Donald's chest tight with longing. "Your certainty," she said. "Not about business or money or success. Your certainty about what mattered. You were the only person I'd ever met who seemed to know, without any doubt, the difference between what was important and what was just noise. And then I forgot." "You didn't forget, Donald. You decided the noise was more important than the music." The metaphor hit him like a physical blow. How many evenings had he come home to find Kiara playing piano, their old upright in the Brooklyn apartment, then the baby grand in their Manhattan penthouse, only to retreat to his study because he had important calls to make. When had he stopped listening to her music? "I have a confession," Kiara said, and something in her tone made Donald turn to face her fully. "I didn't come to this party to see old friends or network with potential clients. No. I came because I knew you'd be here. With her." Kiara's glance toward the lower deck, where Ivy was probably still sleeping off champagne and wounded pride, was sharp with something that looked like jealousy. "I wanted to see if it was real." "If what was real?" "If you'd actually moved on. If the man I loved had been replaced by someone who could be happy with." She gestured vaguely. "With someone who thinks charity work is not our problem and sees people in crisis as an inconvenience to her champagne consumption." Donald felt heat rise in his cheeks. "She's not, we're not." "Serious?" Kiara's smile was sad and knowing. "I know, Donald. I could see it in your face the moment you spotted me with Prince. You brought her here like armor, but she's not protection. She's just another acquisition." The truth of it was devastating. Donald had been telling himself that Ivy represented his successful transition to post-marriage life, but Kiara was right. The Brazilian supermodel was just another trophy, Another way of keeping score in a game that had stopped making sense years ago. What about you and Prince? Donald asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. What about us? Is it real? Kiara was quiet for so long that Donald thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a complexity he couldn't quite parse. Prince is a good man, she said carefully. He's brilliant and kind, and he sees me. Really sees me. My work, my dreams, my potential. He supports my business, challenges my thinking, makes me laugh. She paused. He's everything I thought I wanted. But I don't love him. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for months. I care about him deeply, and I respect him tremendously, and he deserves someone who can love him the way he loves me. But I don't. Because. She took a shaky breath. Because I'm still in love with my ex-husband. Even though he broke my heart into so many pieces, I'm still finding fragments in unexpected places. The confession hit Donald like lightning, illuminating everything in harsh, brilliant detail. She still loved him. After everything he'd done, everything he'd chosen over their marriage, she still loved him. Kiara, he whispered. Don't, she said quickly. Don't say anything yet. Because there's something else you need to know. Donald braced himself, but nothing could have prepared him for what came next. Prince offered me a partnership, she continued, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. Not just romantic, business. He wants to integrate my cybersecurity platform with his AI systems. It would make me rich, Donald. Really rich. Independent rich. The kind of rich where I'd never have to worry about money or security or building something from nothing ever again. That's incredible, Kiara. You deserve that kind of success. The thing is, I'd have to move to Silicon Valley. Permanently. And I'd have to marry him, not for love, but because the partnership structure requires that level of legal commitment. He knows I don't love him the way he loves me, but he's willing to accept that because he believes love can grow from partnership. Donald felt like he was drowning in possibility and terror. What did you tell him? I told him I needed time to think about it. That's actually why I came tonight. To see you one more time before I made my decision. To see if there was any chance that the man I fell in love with still existed somewhere under all that empire and ambition. She turned to face him fully, and Donald saw his entire future reflected in her dark eyes. And now I've seen him, she whispered. Racing across dangerous seas to save a little girl he'd never met. Working with a man he has every reason to hate because it was the right thing to do. Being brave and selfless and real in a way I'd almost convinced myself was just nostalgia and wishful thinking. Donald reached for her hands, and miracle of miracles, she let him take them. Kiara, I have to give Prince an answer tomorrow, she said softly. I fly back to New York in the morning, and he flies to California in the evening. If I don't go with him, he's going to proceed with the partnership offer to someone else. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Donald. The kind of chance that might never come again. What do you want to do? I want to be brave enough to choose love over security, she said, tears beginning to trace down her cheeks. I want to believe that the man who saved the Martinellis is the real you, not the exception. I want to trust that if we tried again, you wouldn't disappear into your empire the moment things got comfortable. Donald felt the weight of the moment crushing down on him like those Mediterranean swells he'd fought hours earlier. This was it. The crossroads where everything he'd built would either justify its cost or reveal itself as fool's gold. But I'm scared, Kiara continued, her voice breaking slightly. Because choosing you means walking away from guaranteed success and security. It means believing that this time will be different, that you've actually learned something from losing me the first time. And if I'm wrong? She shook her head. If I'm wrong, I'll have given up everything for a man who'll just break my heart again. You won't be wrong, Donald said fiercely, squeezing her hands. I swear to you, Kiara, you won't be wrong. I know how that sounds. I know I have no right to ask you to trust me after what I did to us. But watching you with Prince tonight, seeing what I threw away, it's like someone ripped the scales from my eyes. I can't go back to being the man who chose empire over love. I won't survive it. How can you be sure? Because for the first time in 3 years, I remember what it felt like to be rich, Donald said, borrowing her old distinction between wealth and richness. Really, truly rich. Not when I was signing that Singapore deal or acquiring another company, but when I was racing across those seas to save Sophia Martinelli. When I was working beside you and Prince like we were a team instead of rivals. When I remembered what it meant to be someone worth loving instead of just someone with something to prove. As if summoned by their conversation, Prince Eden appeared at the top of the stairs leading to the upper deck. His expression was carefully neutral, but Donald caught the slight tightening around his eyes as he took in their joined hands, Kiara's tear-streaked face, the obvious intimacy of the moment. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Prince said quietly, "but the helicopter is arriving in 30 minutes to take us back to Nice. Kiara, if you need to pack." "Prince." Kiara's voice was soft with regret and something that might have been apology. "We need to talk." Donald started to stand, to give them privacy for what was clearly going to be a difficult conversation, but Prince's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Actually," Prince said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, "I think all three of us need to talk. Because there's something neither of you knows yet." Donald and Kiara exchanged glances, both sensing the shift in the morning's emotional weather. Prince moved to the deck's railing, his back to them as he spoke. "I've been watching you two all night, and I've been lying to myself about what I was seeing. Telling myself it was just old history, unresolved tension, the normal discomfort of encountering an ex-spouse at a social function." He turned back to face them, and Donald saw something he'd never expected in the other man's eyes: defeat. "But watching Donald risk his life for strangers last night, seeing the way you looked at him when he came back safely, I realized something I should have acknowledged months ago." Prince's smile was sad but genuine. "I'm not competing with your ex-husband, Kiara. I'm competing with the love of your life. And that's not a competition anyone can win." "Prince, you don't understand," Kiara started. "I understand perfectly," Prince said gently. "I understand that you care about me, respect me, enjoy my company. I understand that we work well together professionally and that marriage to me would give you everything you think you want. But I also understand that when you look at him, you see home. And when you look at me, you see a very pleasant alternative to home." The accuracy of the observation was brutal in its kindness. Donald found himself respecting Prince Eden more in that moment than he'd respected any rival in decades of cutthroat business. "I'm withdrawing my partnership offer," Prince continued. "Not out of spite or wounded pride, but because I care about you too much to let you settle for safety when you could have love. Real, complicated, difficult, transformative love." "Prince, no," Kiara whispered. "You can't do that. This is your business, your dream." "My dream was building something revolutionary with someone I loved," Prince said simply. "But half of that equation was always an illusion. I loved you, yes, but you loved him. And I'm not interested in building an empire on the foundation of someone else's compromise." He moved toward the stairs, then paused, looking directly at Donald. "Don't make me regret this decision," he said quietly. "She's extraordinary, and she deserves a man who recognizes that every single day. Not just in moments of crisis or clarity, but in the ordinary Tuesday evenings when there's nothing dramatic happening and love is just a choice you make over and over again." "I know," Donald said. "I won't forget again." "See that you don't," Prince replied. "Because if you hurt her again, I'll make it my personal mission to destroy every business deal you touch for the rest of your life. And I have the resources to do it." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that Donald had no doubt it was completely genuine. Prince Eden might be stepping aside gracefully, but he was also making it clear that this was Kiara's last chance to choose Donald, and Donald's last chance to choose her. Then Prince was gone, his footsteps echoing down the stairs as he went to collect his things and arrange alternative transportation back to the mainland. Kiara and Donald sat in stunned silence, the morning sun now fully risen, painting the calm Mediterranean in shades of gold and possibility. "He just walked away from me," Kiara said wonderingly. "A brilliant, successful, kind man just walked away because he could see I was in love with someone else." "Someone else who spent 3 years taking you for granted," Donald said, the self-recrimination harsh in his voice. "Yes," she agreed simply. "But also someone else who remembered how to be a hero when it mattered. Someone else who's sitting here promising to choose love over empire, even though empire has been his entire identity for the last decade." Donald took her face in his hands, marveling at the familiar geography of her cheekbones, the way her eyelashes caught the morning light, the soft skin he'd memorized during their marriage and mourned during their divorce. "I choose you," he said simply. "Over every acquisition, every merger, every opportunity that would take me away from you. I choose you, Kiara. Not because you're convenient or because you make me look good or because you fit into my plans. I choose you because loving you is the only thing that's ever made me feel like the man I was meant to be." When she kissed him, it tasted like salt air and second chances, like the memory of everything they'd been and the promise of everything they could become. But even as Donald lost himself in the miracle of holding his wife, ex-wife, but maybe not for much longer, again, a small part of his mind registered the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Their moment of revelation was ending. Soon, they'd have to return to the real world, where second chances required more than just love. They required the kind of sustained, daily commitment that had defeated them the first time. The question was whether the man who'd risked his life for the Martinellis could also risk his empire for love. And whether, this time, that would be enough. The helicopter ride back to Nice should have been a triumph. Donald and Kiara reunited, Prince graciously stepping aside, love conquering the obstacles that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier. Instead, it became the beginning of their darkest hour. It started with the phone calls. Donald's phone had been buzzing incessantly since they'd lifted off from Charlotte's yacht, but he'd been ignoring it, lost in the miracle of Kiara's hand in his, the way she'd curled against his side in the helicopter's cramped cabin like she belonged there. But when they landed in Nice, his assistant Rebecca was waiting on the tarmac with an expression that Donald recognized from a dozen corporate crises. "What is it?" he asked, not letting go of Kiara's hand even as Rebecca approached with obvious urgency. "Sir, we have a situation," Rebecca said, her usual composed demeanor cracked with stress. "The Singapore partners have called an emergency meeting. They are threatening to pull out of the entire deal unless you're in the boardroom in New York by noon tomorrow." Donald felt the familiar clutch of business panic in his chest. The Singapore deal wasn't just another acquisition. It was the cornerstone of his expansion into Asian markets, worth $18 billion and 3 years of careful negotiation. What spooked them? He asked, already running calculations in his head. Nice to New York was an 8-hour flight, which meant leaving immediately to make the noon deadline. "Apparently someone leaked details about your rescue operation last night to the financial press," Rebecca said, her air quotes making it clear what she thought of that terminology. "The Wall Street Journal is running a story about how Donald Gilbert abandoned his date to go save common fishermen in dangerous conditions. The Singapore partners are reading it as evidence that you're becoming unstable and distracted from business priorities." Donald felt the world shift beneath his feet. Of course his moment of heroism, his rediscovery of his better self, would be twisted into evidence of unfitness for business leadership. "It gets worse," Rebecca continued. "Ivy gave an interview to Page 6. She's claiming you humiliated her at the party, abandoned her for your ex-wife, and showed concerning disregard for safety and propriety. She's calling it erratic behavior and suggesting you might be having some kind of breakdown." Beside him, Donald felt Kiara tense. He looked down to see her face going pale as she processed the implications. "How bad is it?" Kiara asked quietly. "Bad," Rebecca admitted. "The Singapore deal was already on shaky ground because of the regulatory challenges in Hong Kong. This gives them the excuse they've been looking for to walk away clean. If they pull out, it could trigger a domino effect. Other international partners might start questioning Mr. Gilbert's reliability." Donald's mind was racing through scenarios, each one worse than the last. His empire wasn't just built on assets. It was built on reputation, on the perception of Donald Gilbert as an unstoppable force of business nature. If that perception cracked, "I have to go," he said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. "I have to get to New York, fix this, shore up the partnerships before." "No." Kiara's voice was quiet but steel strong. She pulled her hand from his, stepping back with an expression he knew too well, the look of a woman watching history repeat itself. "Kiara, you don't understand. This isn't just about money. If the Singapore deal collapses, it could trigger a cascade failure. Thousands of jobs, pension funds invested in my companies, suppliers who depend on." "I understand perfectly," she said, and Donald heard the old pain creeping back into her voice. "I understand that we're right back where we started. Empire trumps everything else. Empire trumps love, trumps promises, trumps the man you swore you'd become just 3 hours ago. That's not fair. This is a crisis. Our marriage was a crisis." The words exploded from her with 3 years' worth of suppressed fury. "Our relationship was bleeding to death, and you treated it like a minor scheduling inconvenience compared to your precious deals and acquisitions." Around them, the private airport buzzed with activity, but Donald felt like they were alone in a bubble of devastation. Other travelers moved past with their own urgent destinations, their own important business, but all he could see was the way Kiara's face was closing off, the way she was rebuilding her walls in real time. "Please," he said desperately, "come with me. We'll handle this together, and then..." "And then what, Donald?" Then there will be another crisis, another deal, another reason why your empire needs you more than I do. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I've been down this road. I know every mile marker. Rebecca was shifting uncomfortably, clearly aware that she was witnessing something intensely private and painful. But she was also checking her watch, calculating flight times and boardroom schedules with the ruthless efficiency that had made her indispensable to Donald's operation. "Sir," she said carefully, "the jet is fueled and ready. If we leave in the next 10 minutes, we can still make New York with an hour to spare for prep." Donald looked between his assistant, representing everything he'd built, everything he thought he was, and Kiara, representing everything he'd lost and everything he could still save. "Go," Kiara said softly, and the resignation in her voice was worse than anger would have been. "Go save your empire, Donald. It's what you do. It's who you are." "I'm not the same man who." "Aren't you?" she challenged. "Because from where I'm standing, you look exactly the same. Faced with a choice between love and business, between the person you want to be and the person you've always been, you're choosing exactly what you chose before." Donald felt panic rising in his chest, not the familiar panic of potential business losses, but something deeper and more terrifying. The panic of watching his last chance at happiness walk away. "If I don't go," he said desperately, "if I let this deal collapse, I lose everything. Not just money, Kiara. Everything I've built, everything I've worked for." "And if you do go," she replied, tears beginning to trace down her cheeks again, "you lose me. Again. For good this time." The ultimatum hung in the salt-tinged airport air like a sword over his head. Choose the empire or choose the woman. Choose the identity he'd spent decades building or choose the man he'd been for one shining moment last night on dangerous seas. "There has to be another way," Donald said, but even as he spoke the words, he could see the answer in Kiara's eyes. "There was another way," she said gently. 3 years ago, there were a dozen other ways. But you've used up all your other ways, Donald. This is it. This is your moment to prove that love matters more than empire. Not next week, not after you fix this one last crisis. Now." Rebecca cleared her throat apologetically. "Sir, I really need a decision. The Singapore partners are already in emergency session. Every minute we delay." "I know," Donald snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. None of this was Rebecca's fault. She was just doing her job, the job he'd trained her to do, prioritizing business above all else. He looked at Kiara one more time, memorizing the way the Mediterranean sunlight caught in her hair, the familiar curve of her lips, the intelligence and strength and beauty that he'd been too busy to appreciate when he'd had the right to wake up beside it every morning. "I have to go," he whispered, and watched something die in her eyes. "I know you do," she replied. "Because that's who you are. And I finally understand that you're never going to change." She turned to walk away, and Donald felt his entire world fracturing like thin ice under pressure. "Kiara, wait." She paused without turning around. "Prince was right to walk away from me," she said quietly. "But not for the reasons he thought. He walked away because he could see I was in love with you. What he didn't realize is that being in love with you is just another way of being alone." Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd of travelers, leaving Donald standing on the tarmac with his assistant and his private jet and his empire that suddenly felt like an elaborate mausoleum. "Sir," Rebecca prompted gently. "The jet." Donald closed his eyes, seeing Kiara's face, remembering the weight of her hand in his, the taste of salt and possibility when she'd kissed him at sunrise. Then he opened them and walked toward the plane that would take him back to New York, back to his boardrooms and his deals and his carefully constructed identity as a man who always chose success over everything else. As the jet lifted off from Nice, Donald pressed his face to the window and watched the Mediterranean shrink below him. Somewhere down there, Kiara was probably booking her own flight back to New York, back to her cybersecurity firm, back to a life that had no place in it for a man who would always choose empire over love. He'd saved the Martinelli family last night, but he couldn't save the one thing that actually mattered. And for the first time in his adult life, Donald Gilbert understood what it meant to be truly poor. The Singapore meeting was a masterclass in corporate warfare, and Donald Gilbert had never performed worse. He'd made it to the Manhattan boardroom with minutes to spare, his usual commanding presence replaced by something his opponents could smell like blood in the water. The $18 billion deal, 3 years in the making, crumbled in 2 hours of polite corporate execution. "Mr. Gilbert," said Chen Wei-Ming, the lead Singapore partner, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man delivering a killing blow with perfect manners. "We appreciate your commitment to maritime rescue operations. However, we require partners who demonstrate consistent judgment and unwavering focus on business priorities. Donald had tried to salvage it, deploying every negotiation tactic he'd mastered over decades of deal-making. But his heart wasn't in it, and everyone in the room could tell. When Chen and his team walked out, taking their $18 billion and his reputation for business infallibility with them, Donald had felt something he'd never experienced in a boardroom before. Relief. Now, 6 hours later, he sat alone in his penthouse office as Manhattan glittered 40 floors below, trying to understand what had just happened to his carefully constructed world. The financial press was already calling it Gilbert's folly, the story of how a rescue operation had cost him the biggest deal of his career. His stock was down 12% in after-hours trading. His board of directors had called an emergency meeting for the following morning. 3 other international partnerships were reassessing their positions. By any objective measure, it was a disaster. So why did he feel more clear-headed than he had in years? His assistant Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Gilbert? I have the analysis you requested on the Singapore fallout. Also, there's been a development." "What kind of development?" "Prince Eden's company just announced they're withdrawing from their partnership negotiations with TechFlow Industries," Rebecca said, consulting her tablet. "Apparently, they are restructuring their entire approach to AI integration. The announcement specifically mentions realigning priorities to focus on smaller, more agile partners who share our commitment to ethical technology." Donald looked up sharply. TechFlow was one of his subsidiaries, and the Prince Eden partnership would have been worth hundreds of millions. "He's targeting my companies." "It appears so, yes. Also," Rebecca hesitated, "there's something else. I took the liberty of running some projections on what would happen if we shifted our business model." "Shifted how?" "Away from large-scale acquisitions towards smaller, more sustainable partnerships. The kind of business model that prioritizes innovation and employee welfare over rapid expansion." Rebecca's voice carried a note of surprise. "The numbers are actually quite interesting." Before Donald could respond, his personal phone buzzed with a text message that made his chest tighten. "Kiara, saw the news about Singapore. I'm sorry. I know how much that deal meant to you." Just that. No anger, no recrimination, just the same quiet compassion she'd always shown when he was hurting, even when he'd been the one to cause the hurt in the first place. He stared at the message for a long moment, then looked up at Rebecca. "Cancel tomorrow's board meeting," he said. "Sir." "Cancel it. Reschedule for next week. I need time to think." Donald stood, moving to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city he'd spent decades trying to conquer. "Also, I want you to set up meetings with our division heads. All of them. But not here. I want to visit their offices, see their operations firsthand." "Mr. Gilbert, I'm not sure I understand." "I want to remember what we actually do," Donald said, pressing his hand against the cool glass. "Not the financial engineering or the market positioning or the shareholder value creation. I want to remember what our companies actually produce, who they employ, whose lives they touch." Rebecca made notes on her tablet, though Donald could see the confusion in her expression. In 15 years of working for him, he'd never asked to visit operational facilities unless there was a crisis to manage or efficiency to improve. "Also," Donald continued, "I want you to research something for me. Cybersecurity firms in the New York area. Small ones, particularly those founded by women or minority entrepreneurs. I want to know which ones are struggling with funding or looking for strategic partnerships." Now Rebecca's confusion was complete. "Sir, we don't typically invest in cybersecurity. It's not really aligned with our portfolio strategy." "Maybe our portfolio strategy is wrong," Donald said quietly. He spent the rest of the evening doing something he hadn't done in years, actually thinking instead of just reacting. He walked through his penthouse apartment, really seeing it for the first time in months. The expensive art that his decorator had chosen. The furniture that had never felt like home. The kitchen where he'd never cooked a meal because he was always at business dinners or working late. It was a monument to success and a mausoleum for a life. Around midnight, his phone rang. Prince Eden's name appeared on the screen, and Donald found himself answering before he could think better of it. "Congratulations," Prince said without preamble. "I heard about Singapore. That's an interesting reaction to someone's business failure." "Is it a failure?" Prince asked. "Or is it liberation?" Donald was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I'm not sure yet. Can I tell you something, Donald?" I've been watching your business model for years, and I've always thought you were the most talented man wasting the most potential I'd ever encountered. Explain. You have incredible instincts, natural leadership ability, and resources that most entrepreneurs can only dream of. But you've spent decades using those gifts to build an empire that doesn't actually create anything meaningful. You acquire, you consolidate, you extract value. But you don't build. The observation was devastatingly accurate, and Donald found he didn't have the energy to argue with it. The man who saved the Martinellis, Prince continued, that's a man who builds, who creates, who makes the world a little better by existing in it. That man could do incredible things if he stopped being afraid of being ordinary. And what makes you think that man still exists? Because Kiara sees him. And Kiara is the most perceptive person I've ever met. If she believes you can change, maybe you should start believing it too. After Prince hung up, Donald sat in his empty penthouse, staring out at the city lights and thinking about fishermen and rescue operations and the difference between building empires and building lives. At 2 a.m., he made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. He called Rebecca. Sir. Her voice was groggy but instantly alert. The occupational hazard of working for a man whose crises rarely respected normal business hours. I want you to draft a letter to the board, Donald said. I'm stepping down as CEO. There was a long pause. Sir, I think maybe you should get some sleep before making any major decisions. I'm not tired, Rebecca. I'm awake for the first time in years. Donald moved to his study, pulling out paper and pen instead of reaching for his laptop. Some decisions required the physical act of handwriting. I'm going to restructure everything. The whole empire. Break it apart, sell off the acquisitions that don't align with actually creating value, and focus on building things that matter. Mr. Gilbert, with respect, this sounds like a reaction to losing the Singapore deal. These kinds of dramatic changes are exactly what I should have made 3 years ago, Donald finished. When the woman I loved was begging me to remember who I used to be before I decided empire was more important than everything else. He spent the rest of the night writing, letters to his board, plans for restructuring, lists of companies that would be better served by different ownership. But most importantly, he wrote a letter to Kiara. Not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter on real paper, the kind of romantic gesture she used to love before he'd become too busy for romance. Kiara, you were right about everything. The empire I built to prove I was worthy of you was the very thing that made me unworthy of you. I chose safety over love, image over truth, acquisition over creation. I lost Singapore today, and it was the best thing that could have happened to me, because it reminded me that some things can't be bought, consolidated, or acquired. They have to be earned every single day through the choices we make about who we want to be. I'm choosing to be the man who saves strangers in storms. The man who builds instead of just acquiring. The man who remembers that being rich isn't about what you own. It's about what you're willing to give up for love. I don't know if it's too late for us. I don't know if you can forgive a man who needed to lose everything to remember what mattered most. But I'm asking for the chance to prove that the person you fell in love with is still here, buried under years of fear and ambition but finally ready to come home. I love you, not as consolation prize or second choice, but as the beginning and end of everything that makes life worth living. Choose me, Kiara. Choose us. I promise this time I won't give you reason to regret it. Forever yours, Donald. As dawn broke over Manhattan, Donald Gilbert sealed the letter and prepared to find out whether love could triumph over the wreckage of an empire built on everything except what actually mattered. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like a man worth choosing. The question was whether he'd realized it soon enough. Kiara was in her office at midnight, surrounded by code printouts and empty coffee cups, when the building's night security guard appeared at her door with a confused expression and a handwritten letter. There's a gentleman downstairs who says this is urgent, the guard said. He's been waiting for 3 hours. Kiara's heart did something complicated when she recognized Donald's handwriting on the envelope. She'd been expecting lawyers' letters about the divorce, or maybe corporate communication about some business matter. She hadn't been expecting handwritten romantic gestures. She read the letter twice, then a third time, her vision blurring as tears threatened to spill. The man who'd written these words, vulnerable, honest, finally willing to choose love over empire, was the man she'd fallen in love with years ago. But she'd been hurt too many times to trust words alone. Tell him I'll be down in 5 minutes, she said. Donald was standing in the lobby of her building like he belonged there, not pacing or checking his phone or displaying any of the restless energy that had characterized him during their marriage. He was just waiting, patient and still in a way she'd never seen him be. "You got my letter," he said when she appeared. "I got your letter." She held it up, the pages slightly crumpled from her grip. "Pretty words, Donald. But I've heard pretty words from you before." "I know." His voice was steady, but she could see the fear in his eyes. "That's why I didn't just send the letter." "What do you mean?" Donald pulled out his phone, showing her a series of news alerts and financial headlines. "I meant every word I wrote. I've spent the last week systematically dismantling everything I built at the expense of our marriage." Kiara stared at the headlines. Gilbert Industries announces major restructuring. Tech mogul steps down as CEO. Empire builder becomes empire breaker. "You resigned," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. "I resigned. I'm selling off the acquisitions that were purely about growth and keeping only the companies that actually create value. I'm establishing an employee profit-sharing program. I'm setting up a foundation for small business development." Donald's smile was self-deprecating. "Turns out dismantling an empire is almost as much work as building one." "Donald, that's your life's work. Everything you've spent decades building." "No, Kiara. You were my life's work. Everything else was just noise I let get too loud." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this transformation was real and lasting. But she'd been burned too many times by his promises. "What happens when the novelty wears off?" she asked. "What happens when you miss the adrenaline of closing deals and crushing competitors? What happens when you get bored with being ordinary?" "I don't know," Donald admitted. "I can't promise you I won't struggle with it or that I won't make mistakes. But I can promise you that I'll choose love over empire every single day for the rest of my life. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Before Kiara could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Prince Eden's name appeared on the screen, and she felt Donald tense beside her. "Answer it," he said quietly. "Donald." "Answer it, Kiara. I'm not afraid of Prince anymore. I'm not afraid of losing to a better man, because I'm finally ready to become one myself." She answered the call, putting it on speaker so Donald could hear. "Kiara, I hope I'm not calling too late." Prince's voice filled the small lobby. "I wanted to let you know that I've been reconsidering my partnership offer." Kiara's breath caught. "Prince, you don't need to." "Actually, I do. I've been watching what Donald's been doing the past week, and I have to admit, I'm impressed. The man who's dismantling his own empire to prove he's learned what matters. That's not the man I was competing with. That's someone entirely different." Donald stepped closer to the phone. "Prince, Let me finish," Prince interrupted, but his tone was friendly rather than hostile. "Kiara, I'm officially reinstating my partnership offer. Full terms, same equity split, same opportunity. But with one condition." "What condition?" Kiara asked. "That you take it only if it's what you really want, not what you think you should want. I've built my entire career on making decisions based on authentic passion rather than safety or obligation. I won't have my most important partnership be the exception to that rule." Kiara looked between the phone and Donald, feeling the weight of two futures pressing down on her. Security with Prince, professional success, financial independence. The kind of partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals. Or uncertainty with Donald, love that came with no guarantees, the risk of being hurt again, but also the possibility of the kind of happiness she'd thought was lost forever. "I need some time to think," she said. "Of course," Prince replied. "But Kiara, whatever you choose, make sure you're choosing your own happiness, not anyone else's idea of what your happiness should look like." After Prince hung up, the lobby fell into silence. Kiara could hear the building's air conditioning, the distant sound of New York traffic, her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "He's offering you everything," Donald said quietly. "Security, success, partnership with one of the most brilliant minds in technology. I can't compete with that." "Can't you?" "Not with logic. Not with practical considerations or sensible life planning." Donald took a step closer. "All I can offer you is love. Complicated, imperfect, sometimes difficult love. The kind that requires faith rather than guarantees." Kiara looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since that morning on the yacht. The man standing in her lobby wasn't the polished corporate mogul she'd divorced. His hair was slightly mussed, there were stress lines around his eyes, and his expensive suit looked like he'd been wearing it for days. He looked human in a way she'd almost forgotten he could be. "Tell me one thing," she said. "In all the years we were married, in all the times you chose work over us, Was there ever a moment when you actually asked yourself what I wanted? What would make me happy? Donald was quiet for a long moment, his expression pained. No, he admitted. I told myself I was working for us, but I never actually asked you if that's what you wanted. I just assumed that success would make everything else fall into place. And what do you think I want now? I think you want to feel seen. Really seen, not as an accessory to someone else's ambition, but as a brilliant woman with your own dreams and fears and complicated desires. Donald's voice was soft but certain. I think you want a partner who shows up not just for the big moments but for the small ones. Someone who remembers that Tuesday evening conversations about your day are just as important as Saturday night celebrations. And I think you want to feel safe. Not financially safe, you've never needed anyone for that. Emotionally safe. Safe to be vulnerable, to trust, to believe that love won't disappear the moment something more interesting comes along. Tears were streaming down Kiara's cheeks now, because he was right. He was finally, completely right. I also think, Donald continued, stepping close enough that she could see the golden flecks in his brown eyes, that you want the same thing I want. The thing we had for those first golden months of our marriage, before I got scared and forgot how to be the man you fell in love with. What thing? Home, he whispered. Not a place or a lifestyle or a status. Just home. The feeling that wherever you are, with whoever you're with, you belong completely. Kiara reached up to touch his face, feeling the slight stubble that meant he'd been too distracted to maintain his usual perfectly groomed appearance. And you think you can give me that? After everything that's happened? I think we can give it to each other, Donald said. If you're willing to take the risk. If you're willing to choose love over safety one more time. She kissed him then, pouring 3 years of heartbreak and hope and desperate longing into the connection between them. He kissed her back with the reverence of a man who'd finally learned the difference between wanting something and cherishing it. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Kiara made her choice. I'm not taking Prince's offer, she said. Donald's eyes widened. Kiara, you don't have to. I'm not taking his offer, she repeated, because I'm going to make my own. I'm going to build my cybersecurity firm into exactly what I've always dreamed it could be. Not as someone's partner or subsidiary, but as my own creation. And I'm going to do it with the man I love cheering me on instead of competing with me. Are you sure? You'd be giving up guaranteed success. No, Donald. I'd be choosing authentic success over safe success. There's a difference. Kiara smiled through her tears. Besides, I have it on good authority that the most successful empires are built on love, not fear. Donald spun her around in the lobby, both of them laughing with the giddy relief of people who'd almost lost everything and found it again at the last possible moment. What do we do now? He asked, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. Now we go home, Kiara said. To our apartment in Brooklyn. The one with the piano and the terrible kitchen lighting and the view of the neighbor's fire escape. The one that always felt like home because we were there together. I sold that apartment, Donald admitted sheepishly. Then we find a new one. Somewhere we can build a life instead of just maintaining an image. Kiara's smile was radiant with possibility. Somewhere you can remember how to cook those terrible omelets you used to make on Sunday mornings. They weren't terrible. They were catastrophic. But they were ours. As they walked out of the building together, Donald's phone buzzed with what was probably another crisis requiring his immediate attention. For a moment, old habits made him reach for it automatically. Then he looked at Kiara, illuminated by street lights and possibility, and deliberately put the phone away without checking it. Some things were more important than business emergencies. Some things were more important than empires. Some things, like the woman walking beside him, like the love they'd almost thrown away, like the life they were finally ready to build together, were worth everything. 1 year later, the wedding was nothing like their first one. Instead of the intimate ceremony in Kiara's grandmother's church, they chose the deck of a restored fishing boat in Maine. The same waters where Donald had learned to read weather and waves as a boy, long before he'd learned to read financial statements. The guest list was small but meaningful. Charlotte Dubois had flown in from Monaco, her sharp wit softened by genuine affection for the couple who'd found their way back to each other. The Martinelli family was there too, Paolo and Maria and 12-year-old Sophia, who'd insisted on being flower girl for the man who'd saved her life. And Prince Eden stood as Donald's best man. Their rivalry transformed into respect and, surprisingly, genuine friendship. Are you nervous? Prince asked as they watched guests take their seats on the boat's deck. Terrified, Donald admitted. But not about marrying her. About being worthy of her every single day for the rest of our lives. Good, Prince said with a smile. The moment you stop being terrified of losing her is the moment you start taking her for granted again. The ceremony itself was officiated by Captain Murphy, the old fisherman who'd taught Donald to sail 30 years earlier. His words were simple and true. Love ain't a feeling, it's a choice. You choose it when it's easy, you choose it when it's hard, and you especially choose it when you don't feel like choosing it. When Kiara walked down the makeshift aisle, wearing a simple white dress and her grandmother's pearl necklace, Donald felt the same breathless wonder he'd experienced the first time he'd seen her, but deeper now, tempered by loss and sharpened by gratitude. Her cybersecurity firm had tripled in size over the past year, specializing in protecting small businesses and nonprofits from increasingly sophisticated attacks. She'd been featured on the cover of Tech Weekly as the ethical hacker changing the game, and 3 universities had offered her guest professorships. Donald had found his own path back to meaningful work. The foundation he'd established was funding technology education in underserved communities, and he'd returned to his main roots by investing in sustainable fishing operations and coastal preservation. His net worth was a fraction of what it had been at its peak, but his sense of purpose had never been stronger. The first time we did this, Kiara said during her vows, I promised to love you for richer or poorer. I had no idea how poor we'd have to become to remember what rich actually meant. The first time we did this, Donald replied, I thought love was something you earned through achievement. I didn't understand it was something you chose through action. Every morning, every decision, every moment when the world tries to convince you that something else matters more. They exchanged rings, simple bands they'd chosen together, nothing like the elaborate diamond set that had been more about making a statement than making a promise. When Captain Murphy pronounced them husband and wife, Donald kissed Kiara with the passionate gratitude of a man who'd been given a second chance at the only thing that actually mattered. The reception was held on the dock, with lobster rolls and local beer instead of champagne and caviar. Sophia Martinelli played violin while the adults danced on the wooden pier, their celebration simple and joyful and completely authentic. Any regrets? Kiara asked as they swayed to the music, her head on Donald's shoulder. About what? Giving up the empire. The deals, the acquisitions, the thrill of corporate conquest. Donald was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. I miss the adrenaline sometimes, he admitted. The rush of closing a major deal or outmaneuvering a competitor. But I don't miss the emptiness that came after. The way nothing was ever enough, no victory was ever satisfying. And now I get my adrenaline from watching you solve impossible security problems. From seeing kids in our education program land their first tech jobs. From simple Tuesday evenings when we cook dinner together and argue about whether artificial intelligence will save humanity or doom it. Kiara laughed, the sound mixing with the music and the gentle sound of waves against the dock. We still haven't settled that argument. We have the rest of our lives to figure it out. As the evening wound down, Prince approached them with a champagne glass and a smile that held no trace of the sadness that had marked their last meeting on Charlotte's yacht. A toast, he said, raising his glass. To second chances, to choosing love over logic, and to the most expensive lesson in corporate history. The Singapore deal? Donald asked. No, Prince replied. Learning that the only acquisition that matters is acquiring the wisdom to know what you already have. They clinked glasses as fireworks began to bloom over the harbor. Not the elaborate displays of wealth Donald used to commission for business events, but simple sparklers held by their friends and family, creating temporary magic in the main twilight. Later that night, in the small seaside in where they were spending their wedding night, Kiara curled against Donald's side with the easy intimacy of people who'd found their way home. What are you thinking about? She asked. The yacht party, Donald said. How watching you with Prince made me realize I'd thrown away the most precious thing in my life for an empire that would never love me back. And now I know the difference between being successful and being fulfilled. Between building an empire and building a life. Between wanting someone and cherishing them. Kiara traced patterns on his chest, her touch familiar and new all at once. We're going to have to work at this, you know. Marriage isn't a destination, it's a daily choice. And we've both proven we're capable of making terrible choices when we're scared or overwhelmed. I know, Donald said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. But I also know that I'd rather make mistakes with you than live perfectly without you. And I finally understand that love isn't something you achieve, it's something you practice. What do you want to practice first? Donald's answer was a kiss that tasted like sea salt and new beginnings, like the promise of ordinary Tuesday evenings and extraordinary shared dreams. As they made love with the gentle sound of waves outside their window, both of them felt the profound peace that comes from finally, completely choosing the right thing. Over the next months and years, there would be challenges. Donald would sometimes struggle with the slower pace of meaningful work over rapid acquisition. Kiara would occasionally doubt whether their love could survive the pressures of building their separate careers while nurturing their shared life. But they would meet each challenge the same way they'd found their way back to each other, with honest communication, daily choice, and the bone-deep understanding that what they'd built together was worth protecting above all else. Donald never did rebuild his empire. Instead, he built something far more valuable, a marriage based on partnership rather than possession, success measured in shared laughter rather than stock prices, and wealth calculated in moments of genuine connection rather than zeros in bank accounts. And every morning when he woke up beside Kiara, watching her sleep in the early light filtering through their bedroom windows, Donald Gilbert felt richer than all his billions had ever made him feel. Because he'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. The only empire worth building is one where love is both the foundation and the goal. And that empire, built on daily choices and sustained commitment and the courage to choose each other again and again, would last far longer than any corporate dynasty ever could. Thank you for joining Donald and Kiara on their journey from empire to love, from success to fulfillment, from wealth to true richness. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below sharing your own thoughts about love, second chances, and what really matters in life. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us that the most valuable things in life can't be bought. They can only be chosen, daily, with courage and hope. What lesson from Donald and Kiara's story resonated most with you? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. And if you enjoyed this emotional journey, make sure you're subscribed because there are so many more stories of love, redemption, and second chances coming your way.